The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Harold Matthews woke up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m. At 93 years old, his body still followed the strict military schedule he had learned more than 7 decades ago. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the empty space beside him in the bed. Even after 5 years, he still expected to see Martha's gentle smile greeting him every morning. The old veteran pushed himself up carefully, his joints protesting with familiar aches. His bedroom was neat and organized, with everything in its proper place. On the dresser, a collection of framed photographs told the story of his life. Wedding photos, military service pictures, and family moments frozen in time. The most recent photo showed him standing proud in his uniform at last year's Veterans Day parade. Harold's morning routine never changed. First, he walked to the bathroom, holding onto the safety rails Martha had insisted on installing before she passed away. "You need to take care of yourself, Harold," she would say. "Promise me you'll stay strong." He had kept that promise, staying independent in their small house on Maple Street, even though his children often suggested he move in with them. After washing up and shaving carefully with his old-fashioned razor, Harold put on his best casual clothes, pressed khaki pants, a light blue button-down shirt, and his comfortable brown leather shoes. He always dressed properly for breakfast. A man should look presentable, he would tell anyone who asked why he dressed up just to go to a diner. Before leaving the house, Harold picked up his polished wooden cane, a gift from his grandson, and his worn leather wallet. The wallet still held the small photo of Martha from their first date, now faded but still precious. He checked his appearance one final time in the hallway mirror, straightening his back to stand as tall as his aged frame would allow. The military bearing never left him, even after all these years. The walk to Pete's diner was exactly 3 blocks, and Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk. Mrs. Anderson was already watering her roses as he passed her house. "Good morning, Harold," she called out, just like she did every day. He tipped his head and smiled, remembering how Martha used to stop and chat with her about gardening tips. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with only the sound of birds and the occasional early morning car. Harold took his time, placing his cane carefully with each step. His doctor had warned him about falling, but Harold refused to give up his daily walk. It was more than just exercise. It was his connection to the world outside his empty house. As he approached Pete's diner, the familiar smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. The small bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open at exactly 7:15 a.m., just like it had for the past 50 years. The diner looked the same as always: checkered floor tiles, red vinyl booths, and chrome fixtures that had been polished until they shined. "Morning, Mr. Matthews," Sally, the waitress who had been working there for 20 years, called out cheerfully. She was already moving toward his regular booth with a cup of coffee, black with 1 sugar, just the way he liked it. The other regular customers nodded and smiled as he made his way to his spot. They all knew him, respected him, and understood that booth number 7 was Harold's booth. Harold settled into his seat, carefully placing his cane against the wall. The vinyl cushion had a small depression from years of him sitting in the exact same spot. From here, you could see the whole diner and the street outside through the large window. It reminded him of his military days when he always needed to be aware of his surroundings. Sally brought his coffee and didn't even need to take his order. "The usual, Mr. Matthews? 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon?" Harold smiled and nodded. This was his routine, his comfort, his connection to the life he had built in this small town. In this moment, everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and predictable. Little did Harold know that this ordinary morning would be the last peaceful breakfast he would have for quite some time. Change was coming to his carefully ordered world, and it would arrive on 2 wheels with a thunderous roar. The peaceful morning atmosphere at Pete's diner changed forever when the first motorcycle roared into the parking lot at 7:30 a.m. Harold Matthews looked up from his newspaper as the loud rumble shook the diner's windows. Outside, a massive black motorcycle pulled up, followed by 5 more bikes, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. Sally, the waitress, paused while refilling Harold's coffee cup. "We've been seeing them around town lately," she whispered, worry clear in her voice. "They started showing up at Joe's bar last week, and now they're here." Harold watched as 6 large men, dressed in black leather jackets covered with patches, walked toward the diner's entrance. The bell above the door chimed differently somehow, more threatening than its usual cheerful tinkle. The leader of the group was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall with arms as thick as Harold's thighs. A patch on his jacket read Crusher, and the other bikers seemed to follow his every move. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust filled the previously coffee-scented air. "Take any seats you want, boys," Crusher announced loudly, his voice drowning out the quiet conversations of the regular customers. The bikers spread out, taking up more space than necessary. Two of them pulled chairs into the aisle, making it difficult for anyone to walk past. Harold noticed how they positioned themselves, like soldiers claiming territory, something he recognized from his military days. The regular customers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Thompson, who always sat at the counter with her morning tea, quickly paid her bill and left. Mr. Jenkins, the local high school teacher, moved to a smaller table away from the bikers. The diner's friendly atmosphere had turned tense and uncomfortable. Pete, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen. At 65, he was the youngest business owner on the street, having inherited the place from his father. He approached the bikers with a professional smile, though Harold could see the concern in his eyes. "Welcome to Pete's Diner, gentlemen. Can I get you started with some coffee?" "Coffee?" Crusher laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "Bring us the biggest breakfast platters you've got. And keep the coffee coming. We're gonna be regulars here now." The other bikers chuckled, and one of them deliberately knocked a fork off his table, making no move to pick it up. Harold watched as Sally tried to navigate around the bikers' extended legs and pulled out chairs. When she accidentally brushed against one of the bike's jackets, the man turned and glared at her. "Watch it, sweetheart," he growled, making Sally's hands shake as she poured their coffee. The peaceful routine of Pete's Diner was being invaded, and Harold felt his jaw tighten. He had seen bullies before, during the war, and after it. These men weren't just claiming breakfast space, they were asserting dominance over the whole diner. As Harold prepared to leave, he reached for his cane. One of the bikers noticed his movement and nudged his friend. "Check out the old-timer," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Think he fought in the Civil War?" The others snickered, and Harold felt his face grow warm. Standing up took more effort than usual, partly because of his arthritis and partly because of his determination not to show weakness. As he made his way toward the door, he had to stop several times to wait for the bikers to move their chairs. None of them offered to help or move. Instead, they watched him with amused smirks. Just before reaching the door, Harold's cane caught on one of the bikers' extended boots. He stumbled slightly but caught himself on a nearby table. "Better watch your step, Gramps," the biker said, making no attempt to move his foot. "Wouldn't want you to break a hip." Pete stepped forward to help Harold, but Harold waved him off. With dignity intact, he straightened his back and walked out of the diner. The sound of the biker's laughter followed him into the street. As Harold walked home, his steps slower than usual, he thought about what this change meant. For the first time in 50 years, he wondered if he should find somewhere else for breakfast. But the soldier in him, the man who had faced German tanks and survived, refused to be driven away from his daily routine by a group of bullies. Little did the bikers know, they had just challenged a man who had faced far worse enemies than them, and Harold Matthews was not a man who gave up easily. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold Matthews watched his beloved Pete's Diner change completely. The bikers came every morning, their motorcycles taking up more and more parking spaces. They now positioned their bikes right next to the entrance, making it difficult for older customers to walk from their cars to the door. One particularly challenging morning, Harold arrived to find the sidewalk blocked by 3 motorcycles. His cane tapped against the chrome of one bike as he tried to squeeze past. Crusher, who was smoking outside, flicked his cigarette dangerously close to Harold's shoes. "Got a problem with where we park, old man?" Crusher asked, blowing smoke in Harold's direction. The other bikers gathered around, creating a wall of leather jackets and hostile faces. Harold remembered similar intimidation tactics from his war days, how enemy soldiers would try to scare civilians by surrounding them. "No problem," Harold replied calmly, though his heart was beating faster than usual. "Just trying to get my breakfast." He kept his military posture straight, refusing to show fear. Inside, however, he felt something he hadn't experienced since 1944, the cold grip of helplessness. Inside the diner, things weren't any better. The bikers had claimed the entire right side of the restaurant, including Harold's usual booth. Sally tried to offer Harold another seat, but the only available spots were wobbly chairs at the counter. With his arthritis, Harold needed a proper booth to sit comfortably. "Look who's here," one biker called out mockingly. "It's grandpa time, right on schedule." Another added, "Maybe we should get him a high chair." Their laughter echoed through the diner, drowning out the usual morning coffee chatter. Pete tried his best to control the situation. "Gentlemen, please. Mr. Matthews is a respected customer and a war veteran," but his words only seemed to encourage more jokes. "A veteran? Of what, the Stone Age?" They laughed harder, slapping their hands on the tables and making the silverware rattle. Harold noticed how the diner had changed in other ways too. The regular customers he'd known for years started coming in less frequently. Mrs. Wilson, who used to bring her grandchildren for Saturday breakfast, hadn't been seen in days. Even the morning church group that met every Wednesday had moved their meetings to the coffee shop across town. Sally's hands shook more these days as she carried plates between tables. The young waitress had always been cheerful, but now her smile seemed forced. One morning, Harold saw her wiping away tears in the corner after a biker deliberately tripped her, causing her to spill coffee. The breaking point came when Harold overheard the bikers planning to make the diner their official meeting spot. "We'll bring the whole club," Crusher announced. 30 bikes, maybe more. This place is ours now." The other customers exchanged worried glances, knowing this would mean the end of Pete's diner as they knew it. That evening, Pete called Harold at home, something he had never done before. "Mr. Matthews," his voice was heavy with worry, "I don't know what to do. They're driving away my regular customers, but if I confront them, they might destroy the place. This diner was my father's life's work." Harold sat in his favorite armchair, holding his old rotary phone, thinking about all the memories he had in that diner. He remembered bringing Martha there on their 50th anniversary, how Pete had decorated their booth with flowers. He thought about all the friends he'd made there over morning coffee, the birthdays celebrated, the quiet moments of comfort after Martha's passing. As he looked around his living room, his eyes fell on the military photos on his wall. Each one told a story of courage, of standing up against bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted. In one particular photo, he saw himself much younger, standing beside his military motorcycle, surrounded by his brave brothers in arms. Something stirred in Harold's chest, not fear, not anger, but determination. The same determination that had kept him going through the war, through losing Martha, through all of life's challenges. He hadn't survived 93 years in a world war to be pushed around by a group of bullies who didn't understand the meaning of respect. That night, for the first time in years, Harold went down to his basement. Behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums, there was a locked trunk he hadn't opened since 1945. Perhaps it was time to remind everyone, including himself, that old soldiers never really retire. They just wait for the right moment to fight again. The morning started with heavy rain, the kind that made Harold's old war injuries ache more than usual. He stood at his window, watching water stream down the glass, debating whether to make his daily trip to the diner. In 93 years, he had learned that some days carried a different weight than others. This morning felt like one of those days. Despite the weather, Harold put on his rain jacket, the same navy blue one he'd worn for 20 years. His daughter had offered to buy him a new one last Christmas, but Harold believed in keeping things that still worked. He picked up his cane, now fitted with a rubber tip for better grip in wet weather, and stepped out into the rain. The 3-block walk felt longer today. His shoes squeaked on the wet sidewalk, and the rain drummed steadily on his jacket. By the time he reached Pete's diner, the parking lot was already full of motorcycles, their chrome surfaces streaked with raindrops. Today, there were more bikes than usual, at least 15 of them. Harold's heart sank when he pushed open the diner's door. The bell's chime was nearly drowned out by loud laughter and the sound of heavy boots on the floor. The bikers had spread themselves across the entire diner, taking up every booth and most of the counter space. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, despite Pete's no smoking signs. Sally spotted him first. Her face showed concern as she hurried over. "Mr. Matthews," she whispered, "maybe today isn't the best day. They're in a really rowdy mood." Harold could see fear in her eyes, noticed how she kept glancing over her shoulder at the bikers. "It's okay, Sally," Harold said gently. "I've been coming here every morning for 50 years. Today won't be any different. But as he looked around, he realized his usual booth, the one where he and Martha had shared so many breakfasts, was occupied by Crusher and 3 other bikers. Harold walked slowly toward his booth, his wet shoes leaving small puddles on the floor. The conversation in the diner began to die down as people noticed him approaching the bikers' table. Pete watched anxiously from behind the counter, a coffee pot gripped tightly in his hand. "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice clear and steady. "That's my regular booth." The diner fell completely silent. Crusher looked up slowly, a piece of bacon halfway to his mouth. "Your booth?" Crusher's voice dripped with mock surprise. "I don't see your name on it, old-timer." The other bikers snickered, but Harold didn't move. "I've sat there every morning for 50 years, Harold continued. "My wife Martha and I—" "Well, Martha ain't here now, is she?" One of the bikers interrupted, causing cruel laughter to ripple through the group. "And times change, Grandpa. Why don't you find yourself another diner? Or better yet, stay home where old folks belong?" Harold felt something snap inside him, not in anger, but in disappointment. Disappointment that men could be so disrespectful, so ignorant of the sacrifices made by those who came before them. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a deep sadness for how far things had fallen. "I fought in a war," Harold said quietly, "so people like you could have the freedom to be who you want to be. All I'm asking for is a place to eat my breakfast in peace." Crusher stood up slowly, towering over Harold. "Listen here, old man, your war stories don't mean nothing here. This is our place now, and if you don't like it—" He deliberately bumped the table, causing coffee to spill over the edge and onto Harold's shoes. The other customers watched in helpless silence. Sally had tears in her eyes. Pete took a step forward but stopped when one of the bikers gave him a threatening look. Harold looked down at his wet shoes, then at the booth where he and Martha had spent so many happy mornings. He thought about all the memories in this place, their 50th anniversary celebration, the morning after her funeral when the whole diner sat with him in silence, the countless kind words and friendly faces that had helped him through his grief. As he turned to leave the diner, Harold's military training reminded him of an important lesson. Sometimes retreating isn't about giving up. It's about preparing for a better strategy. With his back straight and his head held high, he walked out into the rain, but his mind was already forming a plan. The bikers might have won this battle, but Harold Matthews had won a war once. And he was about to show them that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about knowing when and how to make your stand. Harold spent the rest of that rainy morning in his basement, sitting on an old wooden chair surrounded by boxes of memories. His clothes were still damp from the walk home, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on a large military trunk pushed against the far wall, covered in decades of dust. The key to the trunk hung on a chain around his neck, next to his dog tags. He hadn't opened it since Martha passed away 5 years ago. She used to say that trunk held more than just old military gear. It held the stories of his youth, the memories of brotherhood, and the proof of his courage. With slightly shaking hands, Harold inserted the key into the lock. It turned with difficulty, rusty from years of disuse. The lid creaked open, releasing the smell of aged leather and old paper. On top lay his military jacket, still neatly folded the way he placed it in 1945. As he lifted the jacket, something fell from between its folds. A weathered photograph album he'd almost forgotten about. Harold picked it up and opened it carefully, his breath catching in his throat at the first image. There he was, 70 years younger, standing proudly next to his military motorcycle. "The Night Riders," Harold whispered, running his finger over the photograph. He had been part of an elite motorcycle reconnaissance unit during World War II. They were among the first military motorcycle units, tasked with dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Their bikes had been modified for stealth, speed, and maneuverability. Page after page showed Harold and his fellow riders. There they were beside their bikes in France, then in Germany. Another photo showed them receiving medals for a particularly dangerous mission where they gathered crucial intelligence that saved hundreds of lives. Harold remembered every mission, every brother in arms, every triumph and loss. Deeper in the trunk, wrapped in an old army blanket, he found his leather riding jacket. Unlike the clean, decorative jackets the bikers at the diner wore, this one told real stories. Each scratch and scuff marked a different mission. The unit patches were faded but still visible, the skull with wings that marked them as the Night Riders, the campaign ribbons, the battle honors. Harold stood slowly, holding the jacket up to the light. His medals were still pinned to it: the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. He had earned each one riding through enemy territory, facing real danger, not just intimidating peaceful people in a small-town diner. In another box, he found photographs of his unit's motorcycles. They had been cutting-edge machines for their time, specially equipped for military use. Harold remembered how they'd maintained those bikes themselves, learning every part, every sound. They had to. Their lives depended on those machines running perfectly. One particular photo made him pause. It showed him teaching younger soldiers how to ride and maintain their motorcycles. He had been an instructor after his combat tours, passing on his knowledge to the next generation of military riders. Some of those young men went on to serve in Korea and Vietnam, carrying on the tradition of motorcycle reconnaissance. As Harold sat surrounded by these memories, something began to change in his expression. The defeat from earlier that morning faded, replaced by a familiar determination. He reached for his phone and made 2 calls, first to his grandson Tommy, who worked at the local library, then to Pete at the diner. "Pete," Harold said when the diner owner answered, "I need you to trust me. Tomorrow morning, have Sally save my regular booth. I'm coming in at the usual time." "But Mr. Matthews," Pete protested, "those bikers, they're dangerous. I can't bear to see them disrespect you again." Harold smiled, looking at his old riding jacket. "Don't worry about me, Pete. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to show them they're not as special as they think they are. Just make sure there's coffee ready, black, 1 sugar." After hanging up, Harold spent the next hour carefully cleaning his old riding jacket. The leather slowly came back to life under his careful attention. He polished each metal until it shone, just as he had done for military inspections so many years ago. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just be Harold Matthews, the 93-year-old having his morning coffee. Tomorrow, he would remind everyone, including himself, that beneath his age and quiet demeanor lay the heart of a warrior who had faced down much worse than a group of playground bullies. As he worked, the rain outside began to clear, almost as if nature itself was preparing for what was to come. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Harold Matthews stood in front of his mirror, looking at a different man than the one who had left the diner in defeat yesterday. His old leather military jacket fit him differently now, a bit looser around the shoulders, but still carrying the power of its history. The medals and patches gleamed in the morning light, each one telling a story of courage and sacrifice. His grandson Tommy had worked late into the night at the library, printing enlarged copies of old photographs and newspaper clippings about the night riders. These were carefully tucked into a warm leather briefcase that Harold carried alongside his usual cane. As Harold walked the 3 blocks to Pete's diner, people stopped and stared. They had never seen their quiet neighbor dressed like this before. The morning sun caught the silver of his medals, making them shine like beacons. Each step he took was purposeful, stronger than they had been in years. The familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air as he approached the diner. Today, there were even more bikes than yesterday. At least 20 of them crowded the parking lot. Harold could hear the loud laughter and voices of the bikers through the diner's windows. When Harold pushed open the door, the bell's chime seemed louder than usual. The diner fell silent as every head turned to look at him. Sally, who was holding a coffee pot, nearly dropped it in surprise. Pete stood behind the counter, a proud smile forming on his face. Crusher was the first to break the silence. "Well, look who's back, and playing dress-up too." Some of his gang started to laugh, but the sound died quickly as Harold walked straight to their table. Without saying a word, Harold opened his briefcase and placed the first photograph on their table. It showed young Harold straddling a military motorcycle, dressed in full combat gear, somewhere in France. The date stamp read 1944. "That's a military-modified Harley-Davidson Bullied," Harold said, his voice clear and strong. "We rode those bikes behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that saved thousands of lives." He placed another photo down. "This was my unit, the Night Riders. We were one of the first military motorcycle reconnaissance units in history." The bikers leaned forward despite themselves, studying the photographs. Harold continued laying down more images, shots of his unit in action, newspaper clippings about their missions, photos of their specialized equipment. "See this medal?" Harold pointed to his Silver Star. Cut that for riding through heavy enemy fire to deliver critical intelligence. This Purple Heart? That's from taking a bullet while protecting my bike and the information it carried. His voice grew stronger with each word. This jacket isn't for show. Every scratch tells a story of real courage, real brotherhood. Crusher stood up slowly, his face unreadable. He picked up one of the photographs, showing Harold teaching young soldiers about motorcycle maintenance. You taught motorcycle combat techniques? For 3 years after my combat tours, Harold nodded. Trained hundreds of young men who went on to serve in Korea and Vietnam. The techniques we developed for riding in combat situations are still used in military training today. The diner remained absolutely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to watch. Sally wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to Harold speak about his experiences. You know what the difference is between real riders and bullies? Harold asked, looking directly at Crusher. Real riders understand that motorcycles are about freedom, brotherhood, and respect. They don't use their bikes to intimidate innocent people or destroy peaceful places. Harold reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a final photograph. It showed his entire unit standing with their bikes, arms around each other's shoulders. Every man in this photo understood that. Half of them never came home, but they died protecting the very freedoms you take for granted. He turned to walk toward his regular booth, which Sally had kept empty as promised. Before he could take a step, Crusher's hand reached out and gently touched his arm. Harold turned back, ready for anything. What he saw surprised him. Crusher had removed his leather jacket and was holding it respectfully in his hands. The other bikers were standing too, their faces showing a mix of shame and admiration. Sir, Crusher said, his voice completely different from the mocking tone of yesterday, would you mind telling us more about your unit? The mood in Pete's diner had shifted dramatically. What happened next would change everything, not just for Harold, but for everyone who witnessed it. For the first time in weeks, Pete's diner was filled with a different kind of energy. The usual morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating an extraordinary scene. Harold Matthews sat in his regular booth, but he wasn't alone. Crusher and his bikers had pulled up chairs around the booth, listening intently as Harold shared his stories. This was our most dangerous mission, Harold said, pointing to a yellowed photograph. We had to ride through a forest at night, no lights allowed, carrying information about enemy positions. His fingers traced the image of young soldiers on motorcycles, their faces serious and determined. We lost 2 good men that night, but the intelligence we gathered helped save an entire division. Crusher, who had introduced himself properly as Mike Thompson, leaned forward to study the photograph. The tough guy act was gone, replaced by genuine respect and interest. How did you handle the bikes in complete darkness, sir? He asked, his voice carrying none of its previous mockery. Sally moved around the table, refilling coffee cups, no longer afraid. She smiled as she watched the bikers hanging on Harold's every word. Even Pete had come out from behind the counter to listen, pulling up a chair at the edge of the group. The bikes were specially modified, Harold explained, pulling out technical diagrams from his briefcase. We painted all the metal parts matte black to prevent any reflection. The engines were adjusted to run as quietly as possible. He chuckled softly. These modern bikes of yours would have given away our position from miles away. The other regular customers began returning to the diner, drawn by the unusual sight. Instead of feeling intimidated, they found themselves welcomed by the bikers, who made space for them to hear Harold's stories. Mrs. Wilson, who hadn't been to the diner in weeks, sat down with her grandchildren, who stared in awe at Harold's medals. This patch, Harold said, touching the faded emblem on his jacket, was designed by one of our youngest riders. The wings represent freedom, and the skull reminded us of the risks we took every day. He looked at the patches on the bikers' jackets. Each symbol should mean something real, something earned. One of the younger bikers, who had been particularly cruel with his jokes about Harold's age, suddenly spoke up. My grandfather was in Vietnam, he said quietly. He never talked about his service. I wish I had asked him more before he passed away. Harold reached across the table and patted the young man's hand. It's never too late to honor their memory by showing respect to others, he said gently. The young biker nodded, wiping his eyes quickly when he thought no one was looking. As the morning went on, something remarkable happened. The bikers began sharing their own stories, not tales of bar fights or intimidation, but real experiences of brotherhood and help given to others on the road. Crusher talked about how his motorcycle group had originally started as a support network for veterans before losing its way. "We forgot what it means to be real riders," Crusher admitted, looking around at his group. "We became the very thing we used to stand against, bullies who prey on the weak." The other bikers nodded in agreement, some looking down at their coffee cups in shame. The atmosphere in Pete's diner had transformed completely. The tension of the past weeks had disappeared, replaced by a sense of community that was even stronger than before. Regular customers chatted with bikers, sharing stories and coffee. Sally moved between tables with a genuine smile, no longer afraid. Harold sat back in his booth, watching it all with quiet satisfaction. He saw how Crusher organized his men to help an elderly lady with her heavy shopping bags when she passed by the diner. He noticed how the young biker who had mocked him now stood up to offer his seat to Mr. Jenkins, the high school teacher. "Mr. Matthews," Crusher said, turning back to Harold with unusual hesitation in his voice, "we've been thinking. Our club needs someone who understands real honor and brotherhood. Would you consider—" He paused, looking almost nervous. "Would you consider being our club's honorary advisor?" The diner fell quiet again, everyone waiting for Harold's response. The old veteran looked around at the transformed faces, seeing not the bullies of yesterday but the potential for something much better. In their eyes, he saw the same hope for redemption that he had once seen in young soldiers' faces many years ago. Harold's answer would change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in that diner and in their small town. Forever. 6 months after that transformative morning at Pete's diner, Harold Matthews sat in his usual booth, but nothing else was usual anymore. The diner had become something special, a place where the past and present came together in an extraordinary way. Every Thursday morning, Harold's booth was surrounded by leather-clad bikers, but not for intimidation. They came to learn from him, bringing notebooks and listening intently as he shared his experiences. Crusher, now known to everyone by his real name, Mike, had kept his promise about changing the club. The Night Riders Memorial Motorcycle Club. Harold read from the new patch they had presented him. The design incorporated elements from his old military unit, the wings and skull, but now with a deeper meaning. Under Harold's guidance, the club had found a new purpose. The transformation was remarkable. Instead of causing trouble, the bikers now escorted veterans to memorial services, providing a guard of honor on their motorcycles. They organized charity rides for military families and taught motorcycle safety courses at the local high school. Their leather jackets, once symbols of intimidation, now carried patches earned through community service. "Mr. Matthews," Sally said, bringing his usual coffee, black with 1 sugar, the elementary school called. "They want to know if you and the club can visit next week for their Veterans Day program." Harold smiled, remembering how just months ago, parents would hurry their children past the bikers. Now, local kids looked up to them as heroes. Pete had turned one wall of the diner into a wall of honor. It displayed Harold's wartime photographs alongside new pictures of the club's community service. The centerpiece was a large photograph of Harold in his military jacket, standing proudly with his new brotherhood of riders. The young biker who had once mocked Harold's age was now one of his most devoted students. He had discovered that his own grandfather had served in the same region as Harold during Vietnam. Through Harold's stories, he found a connection to the grandfather he had never really known. On this particular morning, Crusher stood up, gently tapping his coffee cup for attention. The diner fell quiet, not from fear, but from respect. 6 months ago, he began, we thought we were tough guys because we could scare people. Mr. Matthews taught us what real toughness is. It's having the courage to help others, to admit when you're wrong, and to change. Harold watched as Crusher unveiled a surprise, a fully restored 1944 Harley-Davidson WLA, exactly like the one Harold had ridden in the war. The club had spent months secretly working on it, using Harold's old photographs as reference. They had even painted it in the original military colors. "We can't change the past," Crusher continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but we can honor it by building a better future. Mr. Matthews showed us that it's never too late to choose a different path." The diner erupted in applause. Regular customers, who now included both original patrons and bikers, stood together. Mrs. Wilson wiped tears from her eyes as her grandchildren excitedly asked Harold if he would teach them about motorcycles when they were older. Harold slowly stood, supported by the same cane but standing taller than he had in years. At 93, he had found a new purpose, a way to bridge the gap between his past and the present. His military service hadn't ended in 1945. It had just taken a different form, teaching new generations about honor, respect, and the true meaning of brotherhood. You know, Harold said, looking around at the faces that had become his new family, Martha would have loved this. He touched the old photograph of his wife that still sat on his table. She always said that the worst darkness can lead to the brightest light if you're brave enough to keep going. As morning sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, Harold saw his reflection in the glass. He was still the same 93-year-old veteran, but now he was also something more. A teacher, a mentor, a bridge between generations. His extraordinary choice to respond to hatred with wisdom had not just changed his life, it had transformed an entire community. Pete's Diner had become more than just a place for breakfast. It was a place where stories were shared, lessons were learned, and respect was earned. And every morning, as Harold Matthews sat in his booth surrounded by friends both old and new, he knew he had fought and won his most important battle yet, the battle to prove that it's never too late to make a difference in the world.